Tonight's story begins on a cold February evening in 1978, a night that should have ended with laughter, snacks, and the quiet ride home after a basketball game. Instead, it became the start of one of America's most haunting mysteries. 5 young men from Yuba City, California, friends who shared a love of sports, routine, and each other's company, vanished into the mountains and never returned. What happened to them still confuses investigators, fascinates journalists, and chills anyone who dares to look too closely. They were known locally as the Boys, though each was a grown man in his 20s or early 30s. Jack Madruga, William Sterling, Theodore Weiher, Jackie Hewitt, and Gary Mathias. They were kind, gentle, and in many ways vulnerable men who faced small personal challenges but leaned on friendship as a source of strength. On the night of February 24th, they climbed into Jack's turquoise Mercury Montego and drove north toward Chico to watch a college basketball game. They never made it home. When their families woke the next morning to find empty beds and unanswered phones, panic began to spread. These were not reckless wanderers or thrill seekers. They had jobs, responsibilities, and a cherished sense of order. For them to disappear overnight made no sense. As hours turned to days, search teams combed the highways between Chico and Yuba City, expecting perhaps a car accident or mechanical failure. What they found instead deepened the mystery. The Montego was discovered abandoned high in the Sierra Nevada foothills, more than an hour from any logical route home. The car was unlocked. The keys were gone. The tires were fine. And although the road was covered in snow, the car had not been stuck, its engine turned over perfectly. It was as if the group had simply stopped, stepped out into the freezing darkness, and walked away. No footprints remained, just tire marks fading under the snow and a growing sense that something was very wrong. In the weeks that followed, rumors filled the silence. Some said the men had been chased. Others imagined a wrong turn that became fatal. The families waited through spring until, when the snow began to melt, the truth started to emerge, but it brought no peace. 4 of the men were eventually found dead, scattered across miles of wilderness. The 5th, Gary Mathias, was never located. Their story has since been called America's Dyatlov Pass, a comparison to the eerie Russian case where hikers perished under inexplicable circumstances. But unlike those distant mountains, the Yuba County mystery unfolded just hours from bustling California towns, in a place where logic should have held firm, yet did not. Tonight, we will trace that night's journey step by step, not through horror or superstition, but through questions that still echo in the cold air of those woods. How could 5 friends drive into the dark and vanish from reason itself? When rescuers finally located the missing vehicle, it was resting on a narrow Forest Service road, miles from the nearest town and far from any sensible path back to Yuba City. The Mercury Montego stood like a relic of confusion, perfectly functional, neatly parked, no sign of collision or distress. The doors were unlocked, one window partly rolled down, and inside lay candy wrappers, empty cartons, and game programs from the basketball night that had started everything. Investigators quickly realized how strange the situation was. The car's engine still worked. The gas tank was 1/4 full. It had not been bogged down by snow or mud, and tire tracks showed no skidding, no frantic maneuvering. It looked as though the men had stopped voluntarily. Yet the area was nearly impassable in winter, a lonely mountain road known mostly to loggers and rangers, not the kind of place you would end up by accident unless someone led you there or you followed directions that made no sense. Search teams scanned the immediate area for footprints, hoping to trace the group's path. They found faint impressions in snow leading away from the car, but quickly lost them to wind and drifts. The temperature had fallen below freezing that night. Any prolonged exposure without proper gear could be fatal. Still, none of the men had taken blankets or heavy coats from the vehicle. Their thick jackets remained folded in the back seat, as if they had only meant to step out for a minute. For their families, this discovery was both relief and torment. Relief, because at least the men had reached a clear location. Torment, because that location defied logic. The road wound toward rugged, unpopulated terrain. Why drive there at all? Every clue raised another question. The car's undercarriage showed no sign of impact from rocks or branches, suggesting whoever drove it was careful and in control. It was not the reckless flight of panicked travelers. It was deliberate, yet senseless. As news spread, locals recalled seeing headlights deep in the forest that night. A few residents mentioned hearing voices or a shout. But none of those leads ever solidified into a timeline. The abandoned Montego sat in silence through the end of winter, surrounded by snowdrifts, a lonely reminder that 5 young men had stepped out of their normal lives and into something far stranger. From that moment on, the investigation shifted focus, no longer about where they went, but why. Because the car's condition eliminated easy answers, no mechanical trouble, no accident, no sign of violence. Whatever forced them out of that vehicle came from within their own reasoning, or from something unseen waiting in those woods. When the snow finally melted in June 1978, the forest began to give up its secrets. Searchers combing the high country stumbled upon a small trailer belonging to the U.S. Forest Service, a kind of emergency shelter tucked deep in the woods. Inside, they found what everyone had dreaded, and yet, nothing about it brought clarity. On the narrow bunk lay the body of Ted Weiher, wrapped in blankets, his beard long enough to suggest he had lived for weeks after disappearing. Nearby were cans of food, boxes of matches, fuel for heating, more than enough to sustain life. Yet almost none of it had been used. The stove sat untouched. The cabinets remained full. It was as if he had been too weak, too afraid, or too confused to help himself. His death was ruled hypothermia and starvation. Outside, the search expanded. Within a few miles of the trailer, investigators found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling lying close together, as if they had collapsed while trying to reach the shelter. Their bodies were partly consumed by animals and snowmelt, leaving only the outlines of their final struggle. Jackie Hewitt, the youngest, was discovered even farther away, fragments of clothing and bones scattered in the brush. And one name stayed missing from every report: Gary Mathias. His sneakers were found inside the trailer, which made no sense, because Weiher's shoes were missing, suggesting the two had swapped at some point. Gary's Army-issued boots were known to fit Weiher's swollen feet better. But why the exchange happened, or what Gary did afterward, remains unknown. No trace of him has ever surfaced. The distances between the car, the trailer, and the various discovery sites painted a bleak picture. The group had clearly tried to move through the snow, perhaps searching for help, perhaps following a plan only they understood. The trailer was 19 miles from where the car was found, a punishing trek through deep snow and mountain terrain. Some rescuers doubted that men without winter gear could have made it that far. Yet the footprints and sequence of remains proved they did. Each new detail made the story harder to believe. They had reached shelter, found supplies, and still perished slowly in silence. One man disappeared entirely. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of a struggle, just 5 friends swallowed by confusion and cold. By summer's end, the search had officially closed, but the questions only deepened. Why abandon a running car, walk 19 miles into the wilderness, and ignore life-saving food and warmth, and how could one man vanish without a single trace? The answers, if they ever existed, had frozen with the snow, leaving only fragments of a tragedy that still defies logic. Even among America's long list of strange disappearances, the Yuba County Five stands apart. It is not a story of strangers lost in wilderness or criminals fleeing the law. It is about 5 ordinary men, familiar faces in their quiet California town, vanishing in a way that defied both reason and instinct. The evidence felt backward, like a riddle that punished logic the harder you tried to solve it. Investigators at first hoped for a simple explanation: a wrong turn, a car that stalled, panic in the snow. But the facts quickly outgrew those theories. Why had they walked uphill, deeper into the cold? Why had not they tried to light a fire, or eat the rations, or tear up furniture to stay warm? Why had one man survived for weeks yet never used the resources around him? The case attracted national attention throughout 1978 and 1979, with newspapers dubbing the men the Yuba County Five and calling it America's Little Dyatlov Pass. Both stories shared the same eerie outlines: a group of people entering a frozen wilderness, behaving in ways that made no sense, and dying under conditions that should have been survivable. But the Yuba case had an added twist: these were not seasoned hikers. They were homebodies, close to their families, some living with mild intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions that made them cautious by nature. None of them would have willingly wandered into danger. That contradiction is what made the story so enduring. Nothing about their lives suggested they would end this way. As decades passed, detectives came and went. Files yellowed. Witnesses aged or died. Still, the story refused to rest. Every few years, an article, a podcast, or a documentary would reopen the wounds. Some speculated about foul play: maybe they would seen something they were not supposed to. Others thought one of them suffered a mental episode that drew the rest into chaos. None of it ever held up completely. The trailer, the car, the missing man, the untouched food, each piece contradicted the next. The puzzle had all its parts, yet they refused to fit. Law enforcement eventually marked the case unsolved, not because they stopped caring, but because it offered nothing to solve with certainty. And so, more than 4 decades later, the Yuba County Five remain caught between two worlds, not quite myth, not yet forgotten. Their story is told not just as a tragedy of loss, but as a quiet warning about how ordinary nights can bend toward the inexplicable, how a single wrong road can erase 5 lives and leave behind only questions no one can answer. When the coroner's reports finally arrived, the findings were coldly clinical: death by exposure, probable hypothermia, starvation. On paper, it sounded simple. But anyone who studied the evidence could see it was not. These men had not been caught in a sudden blizzard or stranded without resources. They had food, shelter, and heat within reach. Yet somehow, they still died as if every instinct for survival had switched off. Ted Weiher's autopsy revealed he had lost nearly half his body weight before dying. His beard growth suggested he survived between 8 and 13 weeks after disappearing. In the trailer were canned meals, enough to last him months, and a propane tank that could have provided warmth. But the stove was never lit. His hands were swollen and frostbitten, his body wrapped carefully in layers of bedding, a sign of fading consciousness, not panic. The other men had died much sooner, succumbing to exposure before they ever reached safety. Their paths through the snow hinted at confusion. They moved uphill instead of downhill, away from roads and towns. Investigators noted the absence of logical decision-making, almost as if exhaustion, fear, or mental disorientation had taken control. There were no gunshot wounds, no evidence of assault, no sign that anyone else had been there. Just 5 friends overtaken by the elements. But that neat conclusion could not explain the behavior. Why did not they light a fire? Why did not they open the food? Why did not Weiher, who clearly lasted weeks, venture outside for help when the snow melted? Experts proposed hypothermia-induced delirium, the body's final betrayal, when cold confuses the mind and clouds judgment. Others thought the group may have been following an irrational belief, convinced someone was chasing them. The lack of injuries supported the idea that they were not attacked, they were simply lost. Overwhelmed, and fading by inches. Still, many refused to accept it. Their families could not believe that 5 grown men would collectively fail to act in their own defense. Something else, they insisted, must have happened. Decades later, the official cause remains unchanged: hypothermia and starvation. But behind that sterile summary lies something far more human: the slow unraveling of willpower in the face of fear and cold. The way a dark forest can strip even the most familiar minds of reason. The tragedy was not just that they died. It was that they died surrounded by every chance to live, and no one can explain why they did not take it. When investigators entered the trailer, what they found felt almost cruel in its simplicity. The space was stocked with supplies meant to sustain anyone lost in the woods: military rations, sleeping bags, propane tanks, and canned goods stacked neatly in cabinets. Everything they would have needed to survive was right there, untouched. On the table sat an open tin of food, half-eaten, and a few empty wrappers, a sign that someone had tried, briefly, to live. But the majority of the supplies remained sealed, the gas never turned on, and the heavy wool blankets folded in a corner. The wood stove stood cold, though matches were nearby. It was not ignorance that killed them. It was inaction, or something that paralyzed them from doing what instinct should have demanded. Ted Weiher, the man found in the bunk, seemed to have made a desperate attempt to stay alive. His body was wrapped carefully in 8 layers of sheets, as if trying to preserve heat. The makeshift cocoon looked deliberate, almost calm. Yet all around him were tools he could have used to fight back against the cold. A window had been broken to get inside the trailer, but once inside, it was as if his will had slowly dimmed. He had stopped fighting. Experts later suggested that the men may have been physically and mentally overwhelmed. After walking nearly 20 miles through snow without proper clothing, they could have been in an advanced state of exhaustion, hypothermia, or disorientation. Once the brain begins to shut down from cold, decision-making becomes erratic. People in such conditions have been known to sit down and die within sight of help. But even that explanation does not satisfy everyone. Ted's survival for weeks meant he had time to regain strength, to act, to adapt. And yet, he did not. Why? Some point to Gary Mathias, the missing man with a history of mental illness, suggesting that his possible confusion or panic could have influenced the group's choices. Others believe he left the trailer to seek help, perhaps intending to return, and never made it. Inside that cramped shelter, the silence speaks louder than any evidence. The untouched supplies feel like a metaphor: salvation within reach, wasted by fear, fatigue, or something deeper we can't name. The trailer was not just a scene of death. It was a mirror of uncertainty. Everything they needed to live was around them. And still, they faded one by one. It is that quiet contradiction, comfort beside despair, that keeps the Yuba County Five story alive after nearly half a century. Each of the Yuba County Five lived with some level of cognitive or emotional difficulty, though they were all high-functioning adults. They were not incapable. They worked part-time jobs, played basketball, and handled daily life with quiet independence. But they also depended on structure, routine, and each other. When that fragile structure broke, confusion might have spread quickly. Jack Madruga was a U.S. Army veteran, disciplined, careful, and devoted to his car. Bill Sterling was deeply religious, known for his kindness but also for anxiety in unfamiliar places. Ted Weiher had a gentle nature and often sought guidance from friends. Jackie Hewitt, the youngest, was trusting to a fault. And Gary Mathias, the one still missing, had a record of mental illness, including schizophrenia, but had been stable on medication for 2 years before that night. That mix of personalities may have worked perfectly in normal life. Together, they were balanced, each compensating for the others. But in the freezing wilderness, one wrong decision could unravel everything. Some investigators later speculated that when the car stopped, perhaps someone panicked or became convinced they were in danger. The others, loyal and unsure, followed. If Gary suffered a psychological episode, something that can happen even under treatment, it might explain why the group suddenly left a functioning vehicle and ventured into the woods. Friends described him as assertive when stressed, persuasive when agitated. But this theory, while plausible, is painful for his family. It turns him into both the victim and the catalyst. Still, it is hard to ignore how their shared vulnerabilities could have shaped that night. 5 men who relied on clear rules suddenly faced an environment with none: darkness, snow, silence, and fear. In that moment, instinct might have been replaced by obedience or confusion. This detail does not diminish them. It humanizes them. It reminds us how fragile order can be when fear takes hold. These were not careless thrill seekers. They were men trying to make sense of something that did not make sense at all, and in that gap between logic and panic, they were lost. More than 40 years later, the mountain still keeps its secrets. Investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths continue to revisit the Yuba County Five, hoping that modern science might uncover something the 1970s could not. But despite the passage of time and the rise of forensic tools like DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar, and digital mapping, nothing new has emerged. The Plumas National Forest remains as vast and wild as ever. Every few years, small search teams or curious locals venture into the woods, retracing the group's path between the abandoned car and the trailer. They find scattered objects: bottle caps, old boots, rusted cans, but none that can be tied to the missing man, Gary Mathias, or to new aspects of the tragedy. The terrain shifts with every season, covering clues beneath layers of leaves, soil, and snowfall. In 2024, renewed public interest led to discussions of retesting the clothing and items preserved in evidence storage. But officials admitted most samples had deteriorated beyond reliable analysis. DNA degradation, exposure to moisture, and years of improper preservation left little usable material. There were no fingerprints, no unidentified DNA traces, and no new forensic signatures to work with. The hope that technology might finally unlock the mystery has, for now, faded. No skeletal remains matching Gary Mathias have been found. No new documents or photographs have surfaced from old police archives. Even satellite imaging, sometimes used to locate unmarked graves, has yielded nothing definitive. That absence of progress has changed the tone of the investigation. It is no longer a matter of what else is out there, but why nothing remains to be found. Maybe the evidence never existed, maybe it was destroyed by nature before searchers ever arrived. Or maybe the truth lies in a moment so small and human that no scientific tool can capture it. The renewed interest has at least done one thing. It has kept their story alive. Each new article, documentary, or online forum breathes another round of speculation into the mystery. But so far, none of it has replaced the haunting emptiness at the core of the case. 47 years on, the Yuba County Five remain frozen in time, a reminder that even with all our modern tools, some answers stay buried deeper than bones, waiting in silence that refuses to speak. In early 2025, several true crime networks and news outlets revisited the Yuba County Five case, marking its 47th year without resolution. A&E, The Independent, and local California stations released new retrospectives not because of a breakthrough, but because of the strange persistence of the mystery. Every article carried the same conclusion: no one knows what really happened, and no official suspect has ever been named. The renewed coverage offered something between journalism and elegy. Reporters spoke with surviving relatives, who described how the pain had shifted over decades from sharp grief to quiet disbelief. For the parents who once searched the mountains themselves, answers were no longer expected. What remained was the need to be remembered, to keep the 5 men from turning into just another headline lost to time. Law enforcement agencies admitted the file remains technically open but inactive. There are no ongoing leads, no active evidence analysis, and no person of interest identified. The last official review of the case, in the mid-2000s, found nothing new to pursue. By 2025, the sheriff's office confirmed that no new suspects had been interviewed, and no motive had ever been established, whether accident, coercion, or psychological episode. Media retrospectives, however, often stir public imagination more than police reports. Each retelling fuels theories. Were they chased by someone they knew? Did one of them suffer a breakdown that the rest followed out of loyalty or fear? Could there have been an encounter on that lonely road, someone posing as a helper, leading them astray? The possibilities are endless precisely because no evidence has closed them off. The more the story is told, the less it feels like a case, and the more it becomes a kind of legend, a modern folktale about confusion, loyalty, and the limits of reason. Reporters have started to frame it less as a whodunit and more as a study in human vulnerability. The lack of a villain, or even a clear mistake, is what keeps the story alive. For now, that is where it stands, open, unsolved, unending. No fingerprints. No motive. No suspect. Only a car, a trailer, and 5 men whose final choices still defy explanation. As the years stretched on, what little faith people had in the original investigation began to fade. When modern journalists revisited the files, they found inconsistencies that felt less like mysteries of nature and more like failures of process. The Yuba County Sheriff's Office in 1978 was small, under-equipped, and unprepared for a search of that scale. Mistakes were inevitable, but some were hard to forgive. Early reports, for example, relied heavily on a single witness, a man named Joseph Shones. He claimed that on the same night the 5 men vanished, his car had gotten stuck in the snow along that same mountain road. According to his statement, he saw headlights behind him and even heard voices calling for help. But he was in distress himself, suffering a mild heart attack at the time, and later admitted he was not sure whether he had hallucinated. His timeline also shifted across interviews. Still, his testimony became a cornerstone of the narrative, shaping the initial theory that the group had been out there that very night. Investigators also failed to secure the area properly once the car was discovered. Locals and reporters visited freely before evidence could be catalogued. Tire tracks, footprints, and even fingerprints may have been contaminated or destroyed. And when the snow melted, much of what might have been useful food wrappers, cigarette butts, or fabric fibers had already degraded. Forensic documentation was minimal by modern standards. Photographs were incomplete, measurements sloppy. Some reports conflicted on distances between the car, the trailer, and the discovered remains. The lack of precision left gaps that conspiracy theories later filled with imagination. By the 1980s, the file had already grown cold, but in recent years, writers and podcasters have started treating it less as a ghost story and more as a case study in how not to investigate. The most compelling analysis does not accuse anyone of malice, just neglect. Too many assumptions, too few verifiable facts. What remains now is a chain of human error linking uncertainty to uncertainty. The original detectives did what they could with the tools they had. But they underestimated how the smallest details, the direction of a footprint, the timing of a witness's heartbeat, could someday matter. And that is the quiet irony of the Yuba County Five. Maybe the truth was there all along, but lost not in the snow, only in the paperwork. The mystery might have gone silent if not for the persistence of ordinary people. In 2024 and 2025, a wave of online petitions began circulating, urging the reopening of the Yuba County Five case. What started as small Reddit discussions and podcast comments soon turned into a coordinated campaign, part true crime curiosity, part moral insistence that 5 families deserved better closure. One petition gathered thousands of signatures, demanding that authorities allow a modern forensic review using tools unavailable in the late 1970s. Supporters pointed to how cold cases around the world had been solved through trace DNA, isotope analysis, and soil matching, all techniques that could, theoretically, identify where the men traveled or if someone else was present. They argued that even degraded evidence, when combined with digital modeling, might tell a new story. The Yuba County Sheriff's Office acknowledged the petitions but responded cautiously. Officials noted that much of the physical evidence, clothing, hair samples, food wrappers, had not been preserved in proper forensic conditions. Decades of moisture, heat, and handling likely erased any genetic traces. Still, they did not close the door entirely. Some materials, like fragments of bone and personal items, might be suitable for advanced retesting. True crime communities online treated this uncertainty as motivation. Forums filled with users mapping the area, comparing photographs, and running amateur geolocation models to reconstruct the group's path. Others reached out to forensic experts, volunteering to crowdfund potential analyses if given access. A few retired detectives even voiced support, saying a fresh review could clarify old contradictions, not necessarily to solve the case, but to ensure it was properly told. The families, weary after decades of silence, found comfort in the attention. Some saw it as a second chance, others as a way to remind the world that these were not just names in a file. They were sons, brothers, friends, men who had gone out for a simple game and never come home. Whether these campaigns will lead to official action remains uncertain. But their persistence proves something powerful: time has not buried this case. It has only changed who is asking the questions. What was once the work of detectives is now carried by strangers connected through screens, people who refuse to let the snow settle over a mystery that still feels unspeakably human. Nearly half a century later, the story of the Yuba County Five stands still frozen in time, like the snow that first swallowed them. Every lead has circled back on itself. Every theory, no matter how persuasive, dissolves at the edges. There are no suspects, no official signs of foul play, and no trace of Gary Mathias, the one man whose survival once seemed possible. His disappearance remains the cruelest part of the story. Without a body, the questions multiply endlessly. Did Gary die in the mountains, his remains lost to the wild? Did he find a way out and vanish into another life? Or did something far darker happen, something that ended before anyone could see it coming? Investigators have no evidence for any of these paths, only silence. Over the years, a strange balance has formed: part tragedy, part legend. The case has become less about solving a crime and more about understanding fear itself, how it spreads, how it blinds, how it breaks even the most familiar bonds. The men's final choices: leaving a car that worked, walking into the storm, ignoring food and heat, all seem irrational. But maybe that is the point. Fear does not always speak in logic. Sometimes it just whispers, "Run." Families still visit the mountains from time to time, laying flowers where the trailer once stood or where the car was found. They know no new clue will appear, but the act itself feels like resistance, a refusal to let time erase what the world could not explain. For younger generations, the story is almost mythic now. 5 friends who vanished between civilization and wilderness, leaving behind a trail of contradictions and heartbreak. For those who remember them, it is something else entirely, a wound that never quite heals. And so the case remains open, not in the legal sense, but in the human one. The files are closed in drawers, but the questions still hang in the air. Why did they leave? What did they fear? Where did Gary go? Until one of those questions finds an answer, the Yuba County Five will stay exactly where history left them, caught in the fog between truth and mystery, walking forever through the cold. As we close tonight's story, what lingers is not just the mystery, it is the quiet weight of not knowing. 5 men set out for an ordinary night, bound by friendship and routine, and stepped into a darkness that reason still can't reach. Their story reminds us how thin the line can be between safety and confusion, between the familiar and the unknown. The Yuba County Five did not leave behind answers, only echoes: a car that should not have been there, a trailer full of untouched food, and a single name that still has no ending. Maybe the truth is not buried in evidence at all, but in the human fear of losing control, of watching logic crumble when the world turns cold and strange. If this case teaches anything, it is humility, a reminder that even in an age of technology and certainty, some mysteries refuse to close. And perhaps they are not meant to. They stay with us so we keep asking, keep wondering, and keep remembering the lives behind the headlines. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. If you found yourself drawn in by this story, stay tuned for the next, where history, memory, and the unknown meet once more in the dark. Until then, rest well, stay curious, and may your night be calm.